Anybody here know who George Weissman is? Great. So I met George also at this conference, and that's the wonderful thing about this conference is it connects all these people that are working on things, and we stay connected. And so George and I have actually, it's amazing how much effort it takes to really understand somebody. So George and I have spent about 12 weeks in the spring in weekly conversations trying to simply untangle how we each see relational quantum mechanics. And it took 8 weeks of 4 hours a night, for once a week, to actually, for two people who already see eye to eye on relational quantum mechanics, which is something Julia and I have talked about as well, to actually really see eye to eye and find that we agree with each other. So it's been that was a humbling experience to realize how much it takes to really understand another human being at a level where you know that you're communicating. So that's all just an introduction to say I'm so happy to be here, and this is a wonderful conference. I've been here almost every year since the beginning, and I'm excited to share some of the work I'm doing that's really on the forefront of my mind. This hasn't been fully fleshed out, but these are some ideas that I felt it was the right time to begin sharing more and discussing, and I've seen some of these in other talks in various pieces. So my passion is, like Julia said, to study synchronicity. And I think that synchronicity is a manifestation of the rules of quantum mechanics happening in the macroscopic world. And so to me, bringing synchronicity into the picture is a way of bringing quantum mechanics into our daily lives. And why is that so important? Well, I'm going to say that if you start with a theory of consciousness, it may be possible to derive physics from that. As Amit Goswami says, consciousness is the ground of all being. Physics comes out of consciousness. That's my view. And we're all aware that that's not the mainstream view. The consciousness is some kind of epiphenomenon happening on top of the physical world. So could I get some help with hooking up the power to this laptop? I don't know if it exists over here. Does anybody know? See if you can figure that out. Thank you so much. And I may have a Dell power charger that might fit there if we need it. So, a theory of consciousness as the source of physics. Perfect. Thank you so much. Is there a connection between physics and consciousness? Can perennial wisdom provide guidance for us? It amazes me that we live in this world where we value science, we value physics, we value the scientific method. And yet, generation after generation for the past 100,000 years has come across some of the same conclusions. And in our current society, we tend to downplay those conclusions, about God and about spirituality and about methods of knowing from inside. We downplay those as irrelevant because we now know the scientific method tells us everything we need to know. And yet, generation after generation, in different parts of the world, have come to the same conclusions in many ways about life and the fundamental reality that we're existing in. So I have to think that there's something fundamental there that we need to listen to. And so that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to voice one version of perennial wisdom. Perennial wisdom is that kind of tradition that's just arisen over time throughout all traditions as some common area of truth that we might turn to. So the perennial wisdom that I'm going to... How does this work? Talk about... There we go. This is the way I'm going to state perennial wisdom. And this is a very important statement for the talk. We're going to come back to this exact statement over and over again in this talk. So let's read it through carefully. There is one unified entity in existence, the self, which perceives itself, or which perceives the world itself through localized perspectives, individually, separately, one at a time. Uh-oh. There we go. Let's solve that. I think. Yes, it's charged. I just had to turn on the switch. That's all it takes. Got to get all the pieces in order. So there's one entity, one unified entity in existence, which perceives the world through localized perspectives, individually, separately, or one at a time. And from this, I'm going to try and show you that you can actually pull out the principles of special relativity and quantum mechanics at a very broad stroke and show that they're consistent with this statement. So there are really two parts of this statement. It's the same words. Number one, there is one unified entity in existence, the self. You all understand what I mean by that, right? There's something unifying all of us. There's some one source, something that's maybe non-physical that connects everything together. And then the second statement is, which perceives the world itself through localized perspectives, individually, one at a time. What I'm getting at there is, how is it that we each have a separate perspective and we look at each other and say, wow, you're different from me? If we're all part of this one entity, how is it that I look and I say, I'm different from you and we're separate? And that's the second statement, that we perceive, or the one entity perceives itself through localized perspectives, and so there's this appearance of separation. And again, this is all just drawing from traditional wisdom in a lot of different cultures. So now I'm going to restate those two statements in terms of physical principles. The same two statements. So we have this statement here. There is one unified entity in existence, the self. So how do we look at that from the perspective of a physics statement, a scientific statement? Well, let's try this. There is a non-physical realm of information. A non-physical realm of information. Uniform in its information content, which is the foundation of all physical effects. So we're going to call that the information realm. And the information realm is the first piece. And has anybody seen Lothar Schaefer? As you want, but things still happen. I don't know if you can get some backup batteries, but it's on again for the moment. Thank you so much. So the information realm is the first thing we're going to postulate, and that is the one unified entity in existence. It's not physical. It doesn't give us the kind of measurements, the ability to measure things and get physical outcomes, but it is real. It does have some reality to it. So we call it the information realm, and it is uniform in its information content. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And it's the foundation of all physical effects. So that's the physical statement we're going to get from the first of the statement of perennial wisdom. There is one unified entity in existence, the self. And the information realm, let's describe it a little bit. The Fourier transform provides a really tantalizing perspective on the information realm. Now, the Fourier transform is just one specific type of transform, and it may not be specifically the Fourier transform that describes the information realm. It may be How's that? There we go. Okay. So the amazing thing about the Fourier transform is that it literally removes space and time from your representation of a system. So if you start with an object like this microphone that doesn't work in space and time, you can represent it with the Fourier spectrum, the Fourier analysis of this object. And what you get is a representation of that object without space and time explicitly in the equations. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for an information representation that removes space and time or any reference to physical space-time. So that's the direction I'm headed in the investigation, is how does the Fourier transform and Fourier analysis and all the things that go along with it help us understand a realm that is about information and separate from space and time. And what you see here is that what the Fourier transform does is it takes a function, which this might be the function that describes the microphone there, and it's a function of position. And what you do is you integrate over all the possible locations, and you find out the total extent of the microphone. And you sum it all together, and what you get is a representation of the microphone in terms of its frequency spectrum, or actually in terms of its wave number, or its wavelength. And you've removed the reference to space and time. Now, why is it interesting? Well, it's interesting to me because if you start with an object, this is a square object sitting in space. It's a very simplistic way of describing, say, a microphone. Okay? So this is a microphone sitting on a table at a position 30, and it's a size 10, so it's sitting between 30 and 40. That could be centimeters on the table or whatever it is. The Fourier transform is described here. The frequency spectrum is given by this shape. And this is saying these are all the different frequencies that you would have to create in order to get back this object, this microphone sitting on the table. If you put all these frequencies together, you would get a representation of that physical object. Now, you also need to consider something else, which is the phase between those frequencies. And if you take all of these frequencies and put them together with this specific pattern of phases in between those frequencies, that's when you get the actual representation of the object back. So let me back up for a second and explain why this is interesting. This is interesting because every single object in existence has a Fourier representation. That's just a fact. And if that Fourier representation is more than just some abstract calculation, but it's an actual representation in an information realm, and that information realm by its very nature is spaceless and timeless, then we maybe are beginning to see something deeper about existence that is transcending this space-time realm that we're in. So that's what, to me, the information realm is. It's this realm of possibilities in which all of quantum mechanics is pointing to. And it's a realm of information, and information and possibilities are really one and the same here. So let's look at why I'm bringing up this example of the Fourier realm, the information realm. We have an object sitting on a table. I moved the object. Did you notice that? It just moved to the left, to the right? So I can go back and forth. What do you notice changing when I move this object back and forth? The phase. Oops, that's too far. And not the frequency. So the frequency represents the actual energy of the object, and that doesn't change when you move a microphone in space and time. That's why the frequency spectrum can't change when you translate an object across the table. When I move it from here to there, the frequency spectrum doesn't change. But the phase representation, all the relationships of the phase do change. And it turns out there is a one-to-one mapping between the phase and the Fourier transform with a particular object in a particular position in physical space. So that means that the Fourier, again, the Fourier representation is a one-to-one mapping between our physical reality and this information space, information realm. That's important because in some sense it is a real representation of our reality, but in an abstract space. And it's a one-to-one with what's going on here. So I can take every unique situation that we have in this life, this particular organization of people sitting in chairs has a very specific and unique representation in the Fourier or information realm. So the information realm in some sense is a very real representation of physical space and time, but without including physical space and time. And it turns out if you take two objects and put them next to each other, you get a different frequency spectrum because now you have two objects, not just one. You have a different energy spectrum. And so the point is that every one of these, every possible way you could organize objects here would generate a unique representation in this information realm. So again, in the Fourier transform, space and time are removed from the equation. So the information realm is omnipresent. If you remove space from a representation, that means that that representation is applicable throughout all of space. If you remove time from a representation, that means that representation is applicable or valid throughout all of time. So the information realm is omnipresent. It's unified. It's an undifferentiated whole. For the very same reasons. Unified essentially means it's the same everywhere in space and time, and that's what we're talking about. And just at a practical level, light is the perfect thing to study if you want to understand how Fourier transforms work and what the information realm is doing at a simple level. So light is existing in this state of timelessness, and this is some of the previous papers I've written about the timelessness of light and how it gives us a gateway into understanding this idea of timelessness and unified, undifferentiated whole. Just a quick example of how light does behave using a Fourier transform. If you take a set of bands of bright and dark lines, so you have light coming in that's in this pattern. This pattern represents a spatial frequency of about a centimeter per band, or maybe 2 centimeters for the wavelength from bright to dark. And this pattern, if it lands on a lens, what a lens does is it does a Fourier transform of the incoming light. And the Fourier transform, all that pattern of light will show up over here as 3 dots. One, which is the baseline, what do you call it in electrical engineering, the direct current signal. And then you have a frequency on either side, the positive and negative. And the spacing here between the center and the one on the left, or the center and the one on the right, is representing the spacing of the bright and dark lines. So this is all just to say that light is a perfect, it behaves via this Fourier relationship, and it is our gateway into understanding the timelessness of the information realm. So the information realm is information about what? It's information about possibilities. It's information about all the various possibilities that coexist before we actually interact with them and get a specific result. And this is just reiterating, well, you can see that we're getting closer and closer to talking in quantum mechanics terms. Information about possibilities. Now, you're all familiar with the two-slit experiment. I even hesitate to bring it up because it's brought up in almost every talk. But it's a good common ground here. So what I want to make the point of here is that you're used to thinking of light traveling through and hitting a screen and interfering, and you see these bands at the bottom because of the interference between these two slits. But what you may not realize is that this pattern over here is a pattern of possibilities. It's a pattern of this is where the Fourier analysis or the information realm says it's more likely for something to occur. And this is where it says it's less likely for something to occur. And so a single object or a single photon or electron or whatever it is coming through will have a particular probability of landing in a given space on here. And over time, it builds up to give you this pattern. All of those possibilities, landing here, landing here, landing here, landing here, those all exist as possibilities in this information realm, which again is described, at least at the basic level, by Fourier transforms. So omnipresent possibilities. I want to unpack a little bit this idea of omnipresence, because I have rigorously at least attempted to show that light is timeless. And what that means, as I said earlier, is if you take time out of a representation, it means that that representation is valid for all of time and all of space. So if light is timeless and spaceless, that indicates some kind of omnipresent property. What does that mean? How is it possible to have omnipresence? How is it possible for something to be everywhere at the same time? And that's how we think of God, if we do think of God in those terms, at least traditionally. So omnipresent implies uniform. It's the same everywhere in space. That's what omnipresent really is saying. But it's uniform in information content, not uniform in information expression. That's a very important distinction in my mind. So think of it this way. Have you ever pondered on whether it matters where you are when you, for instance, if you're someone who prays, where you are when you try to access your source consciousness? Does it matter if you're at the bottom of a mine shaft or if you're at the top of a mountain, or if you're in the bathtub, or if you're in bed, or it doesn't seem to matter what the physical circumstances are with when you try to access source of whatever kind it is true for you. And that is what I would say, because the information content is valid everywhere in space and time. It's omnipresent. We can access this information realm in the same manner no matter where we are in space and time. And that obviously has been true throughout all of time. That's never changed. Our access to that source has never changed over time because it's omnipresent in space and time. But it's not uniform in information expression. In other words, if someone says to you, anything's possible, I would strongly disagree with that. I have access to all the information, the totality of information in existence at any moment in time, right now. I have access to source. But that does not mean that anything is possible for me, that I can pull out any possibility out of that realm. Now, why is that? The expression into physical form is limited. And this is because of the properties of the Fourier transform. When you take of the information realm, when you actually do a measurement on the information realm, you get a very specific result that is related to, remember those phases that were down here? Remember that phase relationship is unique to every situation. And so you can only access certain physical scenarios in everyday life that are consistent with where you already are. So right now in this room, what's happening is what's happening. We can't somehow manifest that we're all in Boston right now. That would not be consistent, and there's ways to show that it's not consistent with this model. That doesn't mean that we don't have access to the greater whole of reality right here. It just means that we can only express certain possibilities. And it's rather like DNA. If you think of DNA, it's in every single cell of your body. The sum total of information that created you is in every cell of your body. But it's not expressed equally in every cell of your body. Your liver is expressing different things from your fingernails and from your toes. And in the same way, the information realm is omnipresent. It's available to us all the time, everywhere. But only certain expressions of that information are possible at a given moment. So again, we get uniform in information content, but not uniform in information expression. And this second piece is what allows us to live in a consistent world that makes some kind of practical sense. Only certain things are actually available to us. And as I said before, it's the phase between the frequencies that make up the information realm. The phases determine the unique expression of possibilities. It's the phase relationships of the information realm representation of this microphone that determine where it is. If I change those phase relationships, it moves over here. If I change them a different way, it moves over here. And there's a one-to-one mapping between where it is and what those phase relationships are. So let's just move forward a little more. Are there any pieces that I'm not explaining well, any questions that would just pop up really briefly? Yeah.
It may sound like an odd question, but is there some way of actually affecting the phase of something? In your view of it, your understanding of it, is there some way that the phase could be interacted with so as to actually be able to move that location?
Right, I mean, the obvious way is if I move it, I've just changed the phase. But you're asking if you can directly access the phase. Right.
Is there some other thing that you see as being possible that actually would interfere with the phase?
Let's put it this way. All of the different representations of the different possible states of that microphone for me right now is in a definite state. I'm observing it pretty consistently. I'm not letting it evolve into various superpositions of possibilities. So it's pretty much fixed. But let's say Maurizio is out in the hallway. He's not in here right now, so I know that he's not being observed by me. And he's represented by a number of different versions of himself that could all be true based on his past history and where I last saw him. I last saw him upstairs in the main hall. And since that time, his states have evolved into many different possibilities. Each of those possibilities has a certain phase layout that determines where he physically is at that, in that possibility. And what I think synchronicity is our ability to meaningfully select specific possibilities out of that realm of possibilities, that realm of information, and thereby select a specific phase layout. It's the same thing that you're saying. By being able to meaningfully select a specific outcome in which Maurizio walks in the door, if that's something I'm aiming for instance.
So are you saying that your intentionality can actually interfere with the phase and therefore create?
That might be one way to say it. Yeah. I haven't taken it that far, but that's an interesting idea. And intentionality is actually something I've been writing about very much recently, trying to unpack what that really means. Yeah, one more, Siegfried, and then we'll continue and come back to questions.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about what is uniform about the information content? Uniform means
Equal amplitude, yeah. That's a good question. What's equal about the information content of the information realm? I know what's not equal, which is the expression. And so everything else is uniform, I guess is what I would say. Now what that really means, I've thought about it a fair amount, and it's a fairly abstract thought. It means that the information content is the sum total of all the possibilities in existence, all the possible outcomes of measurements that could be made on systems that are not yet determined. And so all of that information about all those possible states of reality is equally accessible, uniformly. Doesn't mean it's equally able to be expressed, because that's dependent upon specific circumstances that we're in. Yeah, uniform accessibility. But you have to talk about it a little more carefully too, because like I said, it's not necessarily that we can access or create any manifestation of anything anytime, but there is a uniform accessibility to the possibilities that are accessible. So that would be worth unpacking a little more. So let's talk about just the nuts and bolts of how I think we can derive special relativity from these principles. So remember the first principle. There is one unified entity in existence, call it the self. And if it's a unified entity, it's timeless, like we said from the information realm, then we can say that the time in between any two, any notion of time is meaningless, essentially. And I assign it 0 here. And I justify that in my papers, so I'm not going to justify it here. But we can set delta t prime equal to 0, meaning the time between any two events in the information realm is meaningless. There's no time. But when you plug that into a physical calculation, you want to find out if there's this unified realm that's timeless, how do the things going on in that timeless realm affect the physical world? Because we know that we have time here and that it takes a certain amount of time for a signal to travel from point A to point B in our life. That's limited by the speed of light in special relativity. How is it that we can go from a timeless realm to a time-based realm? And this is how. If you plug in a very simple, straightforward 0 as the time representation in the information realm, and you use the Lorentz transformation from special relativity, you solve for that, and you have the distance between two events in our physical world and the time between two events in our physical world. You divide out the gamma, you have this equal to 0, and you move things around. What you get is a very simple and straightforward, yet I think profound result. C equals L over T. This is saying that even though the timeless realm of the information realm doesn't have any notion of time whatsoever, anytime you translate into the physical realm, you get a maximum speed of information transfer of the speed of light. This is the second postulate of special relativity. And I took it from this statement of the perennial wisdom. There is one unified entity in existence, the self, which is timeless, but leads to this physical reality in which we have a limitation on information transfer, which leads to special relativity. And the second statement of the perennial wisdom was, which perceives the world itself through localized perspectives, individually, one at a time. Well, that's essentially, and this is a very hand-wavy argument, that's essentially the first postulate of relativity, which is that all reference frames are equal. So if this unified entity in existence has to take a specific perspective on the world in order to get any tangible, meaningful results, then all the different possible perspectives it could take would be equal by symmetry arguments. So each of us in this room has a particular perspective on the world, and all those perspectives are equally valid. And that's essentially the same as saying all reference frames are equal. So there's a tie-in to both of the postulates of special relativity from this. Again, the first one was the maximum rate of information transfer is the speed of light. And the second one is all reference frames are equal. And if we take it a different direction, we can look at quantum mechanics through the lens of these two statements. So again, we have the perennial wisdom. There is one unified entity in existence, the self. That's where we're starting from, our statement of what consciousness is. Well, the information realm fundamentally allows for superpositions of possibilities because it's a linear transformation. The properties of the Fourier transformation or any kind of more general transformation they simply allow for superpositions. If you look at these graphs, you remember that this is a physical object like a microphone sitting on a table, and this is its physical extent in space and time. This is the frequency spectrum of that object, and this is the phase representation of that object at that particular location. If you now look at the same object superimposed twice, in other words, this is a quantum superposition. This is how a quantum superposition would be represented in the Fourier realm. You wouldn't actually have two physical objects in physical reality. I displayed those just so you would understand what I'm trying to show, that there are two superpositions of possibilities. The spectrum is exactly the same because it's really just one object with a given energy spectrum. But the fact that it has two different possible states is represented by the difference in the phase representation here. So again, it's the phases that give you a unique representation of what's really going on here with these two possibilities. So the Fourier analysis in the information realm gives us an ability to easily track quantum superposition, which is one of the hallmark properties of quantum systems. Now, if you instead look at two separate physical objects, here we have two separate physical objects. Here we have one superimposed physical object. This is like saying, here's Maurizio in two different Mauritios. This is like saying you have two different Mauritios out there, which obviously doesn't happen. And they've got that has a different frequency spectrum than having a single Maurizio in two different possible realities. So right now I would say this is true because I'm not observing Maurizio. There are two different possible realities for him. And he would be represented by something like this, which is the same frequency spectrum as just that represents him, but a phase relationship that denotes that there are two different possibilities that I could measure if I do talk to Maurizio or run into him. So again, this represents how the information realm can account for the superimposed possibilities that we run into in quantum mechanics. Superposition. And then the last part is the second statement of the perennial wisdom is which perceives the world itself through localized perspectives, individually, one at a time. So that second part is saying, look, anytime you want a real result from a measurement, you have to take a perspective. You can't just be God and get anything real from the world. If you want to exist and have real results of your measurements and real things happen to you in life, you have to take a perspective. You have to embody yourself. Well, that's the same as in, there's two things I'm going to say about it. Relational quantum mechanics says perception of reality is through localized perspectives. Relational quantum mechanics says any measurement you make is relative to you, the actual observer making the measurement. And that's similar to this statement of physical results of measurements are a result of taking an individual perspective. And finally, consistent history, as quantum mechanics says, the single framework rule is that you have to take a particular perspective in order to get meaningful results. And if you don't take a single perspective, a single framework, you get contradictory paradoxes. And so that's directly related to this idea that in order to have a real place on this earth, you have to take a perspective. You have to plant your pole in the ground and say, this is me, this is where I am, and this is my perspective. There's no way to take some higher view and have a God's eye view of the world. So in conclusion, we are information. Our source is a realm of information. That realm of information is the realm of consciousness. I didn't prove that, but I'm postulating that. And the realm of information or consciousness gives rise to the physical realm. Thank you. I'd love to take a couple questions if we have time. I'd like a volunteer to pass this around. Want to do it? You could take the first question.
I'll ask first.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Guy. I started with one question, but I'm going to switch to this. Isn't it more likely that the use of our intention and synchronicity, which you were leading toward, is that we're not necessarily influencing the phase directly, but more the possibility, the realm of possibility that could make the outcome more likely? Like, we can't all be in Boston, but we could create something that gets us all in Boston. There'd be a time delay.
Right.
But we can get pretty good at intending and shifting the possibility realm.
Yeah, I think of intention as, at the moment, right now in my life, I think of it as a combination of attention and action. So intention, yes. We can create the reality of us being in Boston, but there will be a time delay due to the C equals L over T. We have to actually get there. We have to create that reality and have it unfold. And that's maybe relating to what we were talking about around accessing the possibilities.
But it wouldn't be the phase. Wouldn't it be more?
Well, the phase is just a unique representation of where we're at and where we could be. So there's a Fourier representation, including the phase of this situation right now, and there's a Fourier representation of all the possibilities of us being in Boston. Those are just two different representations, and the phase is in a large sense what distinguishes them. So yeah, I think the idea of going towards a particular phase representation is more abstract than saying what I want to aim for in my life is ending up in Boston, but I think it's really the same thing mathematically.
So many questions. Mina's stuck his hand up.
I face this question myself, so it's a friendly question. But for all of us who claim or hope to, including Don Hoffman, who claim to derive quantum theory from consciousness, the EPR, or the Bell's theorem, showed quite clearly that any hidden variables or anything that is below, quote unquote, of the quantum realm, it's not borne out by the experiments. So, how will you get around this issue of hidden variables, taking consciousness as being a hidden variable that somehow quantum theory gets derived from?
It's a good question. I don't think of it as a hidden variable. It's not another data point that gives rise to these data points. It's a reformulation. I don't even want to say reformulation. Consciousness is the fundamental truth, and the expression of that truth through physical law happens to be quantum mechanics and special relativity. It's not adding anything to the theories. It's putting them in context, I think. It's a great question, but I definitely have never liked hidden variables, and was happy when when I learned that it was disproven. So I really think of this not as adding new ideas or new constructs, but as putting context to the existing theories. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Guy, for the talk. I have just a very quick question. Could you help me understand, in what sense do you mean that the frequency domain is timeless? Frequency, as I understand it, has units of cycles per unit time.
Mm-hmm.
So in what sense do you mean that it's timeless?
Right. It's a good question. I mean it's timeless in the sense that you have literally taken the variable time out of the equation. Now you do have a variable frequency which is dependent on time. And I think this is really a limitation of the Fourier transform. I don't think the Fourier transform is actually the right transformation. I think that's a very specific way of looking at how you decompose a signal into sine waves and cosine waves. I think that it must be a more generic transformation that's happening with the same properties as the Fourier transform. But I haven't figured out what that could be, but that would be the timeless, it would be timeless. Yeah. You got the microphone, you're in charge.
Thanks, Guy. Your use of the term non-physical strikes me when I consider these issues as perhaps being more accurately reflected by the term intraphysical. Intraphysical.
Intraphysical.
In other words, that the information realm, it's not really that it's non-physical, somehow that it's somewhere else.
Right.
But rather that it's literally deep inherent in the physicality of our bodies and of all objects.
Yeah, I like that. Intraphysical. Also comes to mind pre-physical, but that implies an ordering of time.
Variable.
So intraphysical, I like that. Thank you. How are we doing on time? Time to... One more question, okay.
Hi.
Siegfried.
Right, so I was just wanting to ask you if you are familiar with Karl Pribram.
A bit, yeah.
He had the same idea about the importance of transforms, this particular Fourier transform, where he said, well, what our brains do is perform Fourier transforms on the information that impinges on our senses, and transforms that information into something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah. No, that's a big inspiration. Is that work, and I have the same general sense of the way the brain works, and I mean, holography and Fourier transforms have been a passion of mine since as long as I can remember as an adult. So these are the inspirations. Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Oh, and right here is the book that I have coming out from the ICRL Press in the spring. What are the chances? Science, serendipity, and seizing the moment. So check me out online. Thanks.